I am Nia, 36 years old, and standing at my husband's open grave when I realized his family was already planning to destroy me. As the casket was being lowered, the tears on my face were genuine, but the grief of my in-laws was nothing but a calculated performance. My phone vibrated in my pocket with a desperate message from his assistant telling me I needed to see something at the office immediately. Something so devastating, he could not say it over the phone. While my husband's family thought they had successfully trapped me, I was about to uncover a secret that would send them all to federal prison. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who underestimated your intelligence. The sky over the Chicago cemetery was a heavy, bruised purple that afternoon. The rain had just stopped, leaving the grass slick and smelling of wet earth. I stood clutching a damp tissue, staring blankly at the polished mahogany casket, holding Marcus, my husband, of 8 years. A sudden heart attack at 40 years old is what the coroner had said. My entire world had collapsed in a single phone call just 3 days ago, but the people standing around me did not seem to share my profound heartbreak. To my left stood my mother-in-law, Diane. She wore a custom black designer suit and oversized sunglasses, looking more like she was attending an exclusive Fashion Week event than her own son's funeral. Diane was the matriarch of the Washington family, a woman who demanded absolute obedience and ruled her household with conditional affection and an iron fist. Next to her was my sister-in-law, Chloe, checking her reflection in her phone screen, while the pastor read the final psalm. Chloe was the golden child, a woman who treated my husband's hard-earned bank account like her personal, endless, automated teller machine. And then there was Connor, Chloe's husband, a tall, arrogant white financial director who always looked at me like I was something he scraped off his expensive Italian leather shoes. Growing up in a hard-working family, I learned the value of independence and strict boundaries. As a commercial property appraiser, I built my career entirely from the ground up. I used my life savings and my industry connections to secure Marcus his first warehouse lease, helping him build his logistics company from a simple idea into a massive empire. I took all the financial risks in the beginning, while Chloe was out partying on Diane's credit cards and Connor was bouncing between failed corporate jobs. Connor had been appointed Chief Financial Officer 2 years ago, only to keep peace in the family. Diane had pushed for it, insisting we needed his corporate background to handle the big accounts. I always saw through his savior complex and his condescending remarks at our Sunday dinners. But Marcus loved his family and always believed the best in them, even when they showed him their worst. Now they stood at the grave acting as if they owned the company I helped create. As the heavy cemetery machinery began to hum, slowly lowering Marcus into the earth, I felt a sharp vibration in my coat pocket. I ignored it, trying to focus on saying my final goodbye. It vibrated again and again. It was relentless. 5 missed calls in the span of 2 minutes. I stepped back from the edge of the grave, my black heels sinking slightly into the wet grass, and pulled out my phone. The caller identification flashed Jamal. Jamal was Marcus' right-hand man, a brilliant young executive assistant who had been with my husband since the early days of the company. I slipped away from the morning canopy, walking toward the line of parked black luxury cars to get some privacy. I answered the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. I told Jamal this is really not the time because they are lowering Marcus right now. There was a heavy shaking breath on the other end of the line. Jamal spoke, and his voice cracked, sounding absolutely terrified. He said he was so sorry to interrupt the service, but I needed to see something right now. I asked him to tell me what it was, and if it could wait until tomorrow. My head was pounding, and I had not slept in 3 days. All I wanted was to go home and collapse into the bed that still smelled like my husband. Jamal insisted, his tone dropping to a frantic, desperate whisper. He said it cannot wait because they are going to erase it. He told me he found something in the hidden server files, something Connor and Chloe have been doing behind our backs. He said he could not say it over the phone because if they found out he was looking at this, his career would be over or worse. He told me I needed to come to the office tonight and to come through the private parking garage so security does not log my entry. My blood ran completely cold. Before I could ask him another question to clarify what he meant, the call disconnected abruptly. I stood there in the damp cemetery air staring at the black screen of my phone. A sickening realization washed over me. Marcus was not even buried, and whatever parasitic disease had infected his company was already moving to destroy what we built. I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself. I wiped the stray tears from my cheeks and turned around to head back to the gravesite to figure out my next move. But as I pivoted on my heel to walk back toward the canopy, an icy, heavy hand clamped down hard on my right shoulder. I turned around slowly, refusing to show the shock on my face. Connor stood there, his pale skin stark against his tailored black funeral suit. He dropped his heavy hand from my shoulder but immediately stepped into my personal space, forcing me to look up at him. He did not offer a single word of comfort. There was no apology for my sudden loss. There was no gentle inquiry about how I was holding up after just burying the man I loved. Instead, he simply extended his open palm toward me with an expectant, entitled look on his face. "Give me the keys to the Porsche Nia, and I am going to need the master passcode to the home safe before you head back to the house." His voice was flat and demanding, leaving no room for any discussion. I stared at his open hand, my mind racing to catch up with his absolute audacity. I asked him why on earth he thought I would hand over access to my husband's personal safe or his car while we were still standing in the cemetery dirt. Connor sighed heavily, rolling his eyes like he was dealing with a particularly stubborn child. He lowered his voice, adopting that sickeningly sweet tone he always used when he wanted to sound like the smartest person in the room. He told me that Marcus and I were both grieving, and that women in my position often make highly irrational decisions under stress. He said the company assets needed to be secured immediately to prevent any financial instability. According to him, as the chief financial officer, he was the only one properly equipped to handle the complex legal and financial transitions. He actually had the nerve to tell me to let the professionals handle this. He reminded me that corporate logistics was a ruthless, competitive world, and he did not want me stressing my pretty head over complicated corporate numbers I could not possibly understand. He said it was his job to step in and save the day, ensuring the Washington Empire remained perfectly intact under his expert guidance. My blood boiled hot and fast beneath my skin. I was a certified commercial property appraiser who evaluated multi-million-dollar commercial portfolios on a daily basis. I was the exact person who built the entire financial foundation of the very company he was now claiming to protect. I understood numbers, contracts, and asset management better than he ever could. Yet to Connor, I was nothing more than an emotional, grieving black widow who desperately needed a smart white man to swoop in, take control, and manage her complicated life for her. Before I could tell him exactly where he could shove his open hand, Diane appeared right beside him. She linked her arm intimately through Connor's, looking at me with a gaze full of cold calculation. Diane told me I needed to listen to Connor because he was the only one thinking clearly and looking out for the best interests of the family. I took careful note of how she said the family and completely excluded me from that definition. Diane adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses and spoke with a level of cruelty that still haunts me to this day. She told me I needed to remember my place in their world. She said I was just a wife, and that wives come and go, but bloodlines are forever. She claimed Marcus built Washington Freight strictly for his family, and now that he was tragically gone, those massive assets belonged entirely to the Washington bloodline. She actually looked me up and down with utter disgust and sneered. She told me that since I never managed to give Marcus any children, I had absolutely no real claim to his legacy. She weaponized my deeply personal fertility struggles against me right there over his fresh grave. She ordered me to hand over the keys, give Connor the safe password, and stop making an embarrassing scene at her son's funeral. I felt a tight, painful knot form in my chest, but I absolutely refused to let them see me break. I would not give them the satisfaction of my tears. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and looked Diane dead in the eye. I reminded her in a low, steady voice that I was not just a temporary wife. I was Marcus' legal next of kin. I told her that every single asset, every luxury car, every corporate bank account, and every piece of commercial property was legally tied to me. I turned my fierce attention back to Connor and firmly slapped his outstretched hand away. I told him he would not get a single key, a single password, or a single dime until my own personal legal team completely reviewed the estate and the corporate holdings. I told him to back off and stay entirely out of my house. Connor's face hardened instantly, and his polite corporate savior mask completely slipped away to reveal the greedy predator underneath. He leaned in close, his breath smelling strongly of expensive scotch and strong mints. He whispered that I was making a massive mistake by crossing him. He proudly admitted that he had already frozen the primary corporate accounts early that morning, and that I was completely locked out of the system. He told me I was entirely out of my league. He threatened that if I decided to fight them, I would end up with absolutely nothing, and he would make sure his legal team left me completely bankrupt. His arrogant threat, combined with the frantic phone call from Jamal, made everything click perfectly into place. Connor was desperate to get into our home safe today because he knew Marcus kept physical copies of the most sensitive corporate documents there. He was trying to destroy the evidence before I could find it. I did not waste another breath arguing with him. I knew my angry words would mean absolutely nothing without solid legal proof. I turned on my heel, determined to get to my car and drive straight to the downtown office building. I needed to meet Jamal and see those hidden server files immediately before Connor had the chance to remotely wipe them all out. But as I took my first determined step toward the parking lot, a figure stepped right in front of me, completely cutting off my escape route. It was Chloe. She stood there blocking my path with her arms tightly crossed over her chest and a vicious, entitled smirk playing on her lips. "Where do you think you are going in such a hurry?" Naya Chloe asked, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that barely masked her venom. "You look like a rat trying to flee a sinking ship. Or are you just rushing to the bank to drain whatever is left of my brother's money before the estate officially goes into probate?" I stared at her perfectly contoured face and felt a wave of absolute disgust. Chloe was 34 years old, but she still acted like a spoiled teenager who threw a tantrum whenever someone told her no. I stood my ground, allowing a heavy silence to stretch between us while the distant thunder rolled across the dark Chicago sky. I told her to step aside and that I was absolutely not in the mood for her childish theatrical games today. But Chloe did not move. Instead, she took a step forward, forcing me to take a step back as my heels sank deeper into the wet grass. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger right at my chest, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "You are not going anywhere until you listen to me," she snapped. "Connor is right. You have absolutely no business handling my brother's massive estate. You are nothing but a gold digger who hit the ultimate jackpot when Marcus was stupid enough to marry you. You came into this wealthy family with absolutely nothing, and you have been freeloading off his hard work for the last 8 years." The word freeloading echoed in my ears, and for a brief second I actually laughed. It was a cold, harsh sound that seemed to startle her, making her drop her hand. I asked her if she had completely lost her mind, or if she was just selectively suffering from amnesia to protect her fragile ego. I looked her up and down, taking in her thousands of dollars worth of designer morning clothes, and reminded her exactly who I was. I told her I am a senior commercial property appraiser. I evaluate commercial real estate properties worth more than your entire trust fund and your husband's inflated corporate salary combined. While you were spending 6 years failing to get a basic communications degree and maxing out your mother's credit cards on luxury vacations in Europe, I was working 60-hour weeks. I was building a tangible career, analyzing market trends and assessing financial risks. I took a firm step forward this time, backing her up. I asked her if she remembered the cramped, dark studio apartment Marcus and I lived in when we first got married. I answered the question for her, telling her of course she did not remember because she explicitly refused to visit us since our apartment was not located in a wealthy upscale neighborhood. I told her that Marcus had a brilliant idea for a logistics company, but he had absolutely terrible credit and zero capital. No reputable bank would give him a business loan, and Diane certainly refused to fund him because she said logistics was a dirty blue-collar industry beneath the Washington family name. I looked Chloe dead in her eyes and laid out the undeniable facts of our history. I told her I was the one who believed in his vision when his own flesh and blood turned their backs on him. I liquidated my entire stock portfolio. I emptied my personal retirement savings account. I put down $85,000 of my own hard-earned money to secure the lease on his very first commercial warehouse and his first 3 delivery trucks. I used my specific risk assessment skills to find undervalued industrial properties that saved him millions in the long run. I used my industry connections to get him his first major corporate client. I took every single financial risk so Marcus could build this empire. I am not a gold digger, Chloe. I am the gold mine. Chloe scoffed loudly, tossing her heavy silk hair over her shoulder. She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms tighter defensively, covering her chest. That is such a pathetic, desperate lie, she sneered, her upper lip curling in disgust. Marcus built Washington Freight with his own blood, sweat, and tears. The powerful Washington family name is what opened doors for him in this city. You are just the supportive little wife cheering from the cheap seats on the sidelines. Do not try to rewrite our family history just because you want a bigger slice of the pie now that he is dead. You are a freeloader, Nia, and my mother and I have always seen right through your cheap facade. She took another aggressive step toward me, her face contorted with deep-rooted jealousy and spite. She told me I did not belong in their elite family and that I never did. She said the only reason Marcus kept me around was out of stubborn pity and a misplaced sense of obligation because I helped him pay rent a decade ago. She demanded that I hand over the car keys and the safe passcodes right now and said maybe if I complied, they would be generous enough to leave me a small monthly stipend to live on. I felt a cold, dangerous calm wash over me. The kind of absolute clarity that comes when you finally realize the people you are dealing with are completely detached from reality and beyond any logical reasoning. I told her she was completely delusional and that I was done entertaining her ridiculous fantasy of superiority. I turned to walk around her, but Chloe suddenly reached out and grabbed my forearm. Her sharp acrylic nails dug painfully into the sleeve of my black coat, trying to physically restrain me. You are not leaving this cemetery until you give Connor what he wants. Nia, she hissed, her voice rising in panic and explosive anger. I stopped dead in my tracks. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then looked slowly up into her widened, anxious eyes. I violently yanked my arm out of her grasp with so much force, she stumbled backward in her expensive designer heels, almost falling into the mud. Never put your hands on me again, Chloe, I said, my voice low and lethal, cutting through the humid air. If you or your arrogant husband ever try to physically intimidate me again, I promise you will deeply regret it. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I turned my back on her and power walked toward my car, parked on the gravel shoulder. Just as my hand touched the cold metal door handle, the heavy purple sky finally cracked wide open. A massive downpour of freezing rain began to violently wash over the cemetery. I got into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it immediately. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I could see Chloe storming back toward the morning canopy, her face red with rage, wildly gesturing and complaining to Diane and Connor, who were watching us from afar. I turned the key in the ignition and the engine roared to life, bringing a sudden blast of warm air into the freezing cabin. My hands were gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. My entire body was shaking, but not from the freezing rain, and not from the profound grief of burying my husband. I was shaking with pure, unadulterated adrenaline and righteous anger. I pulled aggressively out of the cemetery gates, leaving the toxic Washington family behind in the mud where they belonged. As I merged onto the slick highway, driving as fast as I safely could through the blinding Chicago rain, Jamal's frantic voice kept replaying over and over in my head like a broken record. They are going to erase it. I cannot say it over the phone. You need to come to the office tonight. Whatever Connor and Chloe were desperately trying to hide in the dark, whatever they were plotting to steal from my husband's legacy, was sitting on that hidden corporate server right now. And I was going to rip it out of their hands before the night was over. The drive to downtown Chicago was a blur of flashing brake lights and relentless rain pounding against my windshield. I turned my car off the main avenue and slipped down the narrow concrete ramp leading into the private underground parking garage of the Washington Freight headquarters. The heavy metal security gate rolled up slowly, squealing loudly in the damp night air. I parked my car in the furthest corner away from the bright overhead fluorescent lights. The garage was completely empty and eerily silent, except for the steady dripping of water from my tires and the distant hum of the city above. I grabbed my purse, pulled my coat tight against my body, and stepped out into the cold, concrete echo chamber. Every footstep I took sounded like a gunshot in the massive enclosed space. Suddenly, a dark shadow moved near the concrete pillar by the executive elevators, causing my breath to catch sharply in my throat. "Mrs. Washington over here." It was Jamal. He stepped out from the shadows wearing a dark hooded jacket, completely ditching his usual sharp corporate attire. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, darting nervously around the empty garage, as if he expected Connor to jump out from behind a parked vehicle at any second. I hurried over to him and he quickly swiped his master key card to open the private elevator doors. We stepped inside, and the heavy metal doors slid shut, sealing us in. As the elevator ascended smoothly toward the 14th floor, the silence between us was heavy and suffocating. I finally broke it, asking him if anyone else was currently in the building. He shook his head nervously and told me he had checked the security logs twice before coming down to meet me. He said the overnight cleaning crew was exclusively on the 3rd floor, and the main security guard was glued to a football game at the front desk. But Jamal warned me that we still needed to move incredibly fast, because Connor had set up remote alert triggers on the main corporate server earlier that afternoon. The elevator dinged softly as we arrived on the 14th floor. The executive suite was pitch black. The only illumination came from the ambient city lights filtering through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the plush corporate carpet. We moved quickly down the quiet hallway, our footsteps muffled, until we reached the heavy double oak doors of Marcus' personal office. When Jamal unlocked the door and pushed it open, a wave of familiar scent hit me instantly. It was sandalwood and expensive dark roast coffee. It smelled exactly like my husband. My chest tightened painfully, and for a split second the overwhelming reality of his permanent absence threatened to drop me right to my knees. But I forced myself to take a deep breath, push the profound grief down into a small, locked box in my mind, and focus on the mission at hand. I could mourn Marcus properly later. Right now, I had to protect the legacy we built together. I walked over to his massive mahogany desk and asked Jamal to boot up the computer and show me the files he found on the server. Jamal shook his head vigorously. He told me we were not logging into the computer network tonight. He explained that Connor had already locked down all the digital administrative privileges, effectively locking Jamal and me entirely out of the digital system. He said Connor thought he was an absolute genius for securing the digital footprint, but Connor was entirely too arrogant to realize he did not know everything about the company he claimed to run. Jamal walked right past the desk and stepped up to the beautiful custom floor-to-ceiling mahogany wood paneling that lined the back wall of the office. Jamal looked back at me and said, "Mr. Washington never fully trusted Connor. He told me Marcus always preferred physical hard copies for his most sensitive and high-risk transactions. Marcus kept a completely separate offline ledger that the chief financial officer never even knew existed." I watched in absolute stunned silence as Jamal reached up and pressed firmly against a seemingly ordinary decorative groove in the intricately carved wood paneling. There was a soft mechanical click. A rectangular section of the heavy wood seamlessly popped open and swung outward, revealing a sleek, modern steel wall, safe hidden directly inside the architecture of the building. I stared at the hidden vault, completely mesmerized. I had designed the initial layout for this office space years ago, and even I did not know Marcus had installed a biometric wall safe behind the paneling. Jamal stepped aside and gestured toward the digital keypad mounted on the steel door. He told me the safe required a master passcode and a biometric fingerprint to open. He said Marcus programmed the security system so that only 2 people in the entire world could ever access it: Marcus and me. Jamal said he found out about the safe just yesterday when he was clearing out Marcus' personal belongings and found a handwritten note addressed specifically to me hidden in a locked desk drawer. My hands were visibly trembling as I stepped up to the cold steel door. I entered the numbers of our wedding anniversary into the digital keypad, hoping my instinct was right. The machine beeped a solid, pleasant green. I then pressed my right thumb firmly against the glowing biometric scanner. The machine hummed quietly, reading my print, and then a heavy metallic clunk echoed through the silent office as the internal locking mechanism completely disengaged. I grabbed the heavy metal handle and pulled the steel door open. Inside the illuminated vault, there were no stacks of emergency cash or hidden gold bars. Instead, the safe was packed tightly with dozens of thick manila folders and several black leather-bound ledger books. But it was the specific stack of files sitting right on the very top shelf that made the blood freeze in my veins. They were thick, heavily padded folders sealed with bright red tape. I reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the top folder toward me, bringing it into the dim ambient light of the office. Across the center of the stark white label, printed in massive, bold black letters, was a phrase that explained exactly why my husband had been so deeply stressed in the months leading up to his sudden death. The label read, "Department of the Treasury Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation." I grabbed the thick, heavily padded folder with trembling hands and carried it directly over to the massive oak desk. Jamal quickly pulled up a heavy leather chair next to me, and we both stared down at the documents now illuminated by the single warm glow of the desk lamp. I flipped open the heavy cover, and the very first page I saw was a detailed summary report compiled by an independent forensic accounting firm. Marcus had secretly hired an outside auditor without telling anyone in the company. As my eyes rapidly scanned the bold black numbers and the carefully highlighted paragraphs, my professional training immediately kicked into high gear. I was no longer just a grieving widow lost in sadness. I was a senior commercial property appraiser, and I knew exactly how to track the money. I began pulling out thick stacks of invoices and commercial lease agreements, spreading them across the polished wood surface of the desk. At first glance, the documents looked like standard corporate logistics expenses. There were massive payouts for warehouse renovations, transportation equipment, upgrades, and supply chain consulting fees. But as I looked much closer at the specific property addresses listed on the construction invoices, a cold, heavy sense of dread washed over me. I recognized these commercial addresses. As an appraiser, I knew the industrial zoning maps and commercial districts of Chicago like the back of my hand. I pointed to a vendor invoice billing Washington Freight for $2 million in warehouse expansion. I looked up at Jamal and told him this address does not even exist. It is an empty gravel lot next to an abandoned train yard on the south side of the city. I appraised that exact plot of vacant land 3 years ago for a completely different corporate client. There is absolutely no logistics warehouse there to expand or renovate. Jamal leaned in closer, his eyes wide with absolute shock. He handed me another stack of crisp, white papers from the red folder. He told me to carefully look at the vendor names on the billing accounts. I quickly sorted through the financial documents and noticed a terrifying repetitive pattern. There were 6 distinct companies receiving massive monthly payouts from my husband's corporate accounts: Apex Logistics Solutions, Horizon Freight Management, Pinnacle Supply Chain. They all sounded like perfectly legitimate corporate entities, but my trained eyes saw right through the illusion. They were nothing more than empty paper ghosts, They were shell companies designed specifically to bleed Washington Freight dry without raising immediate alarms. I dug deeper into the corporate registration filings that the independent auditor had included in the report. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird as I traced the legal ownership of these 6 phantom companies. Connor was the chief financial officer, which meant he had the absolute authority to approve vendor contracts and authorize massive wire transfers without triggering any immediate red flags from the banking institutions. He used his executive corporate power to approve these fake invoices deliberately, funneling corporate cash directly out the door. But Connor was far too cunning and cowardly to put his own name on the shell companies. If the federal government ever audited Washington Freight and discovered the missing capital, he needed a perfect fall guy, or rather a fall girl. I flipped to the registered agent documentation for the 6 fraudulent companies, and I felt physically sick to my stomach. The primary business owner listed on every single one of those fake corporate registrations was Chloe Washington. I explained the scheme out loud to Jamal, my voice shaking with a volatile mixture of absolute disgust and pure fury. Connor was using his own wife as the registered owner. He set up these 6 shell companies under Chloe's name and then used his corporate authority to wire them millions of dollars for logistics services that were never actually rendered. He was systematically draining Marcus' company and funneling the stolen cash directly into their personal bank accounts. They used my husband's money to fund her lavish designer lifestyle and his inflated, arrogant ego. I grabbed a desktop calculator from the top drawer and started rapidly punching in the total numbers from the fraudulent invoices spread across the desk. The digital screen lit up with a final figure that made my stomach completely drop to the floor. $12 million. Over the past 24 months, Connor and Chloe had successfully siphoned $12 million in clean cash right out of the corporate treasury. That was money meant for employee benefits, fleet expansions, and securing the future of the empire Marcus and I built. Instead, it went straight into the pockets of his greedy sister and her entitled white savior husband. This was not just simple corporate theft or a family dispute over money. This was highly organized federal wire fraud and massive corporate tax evasion. That was exactly why the folder had the Internal Revenue Service criminal investigation label slapped across the front. Marcus had figured it out. He must have confronted Connor, or he was silently building a watertight legal case to hand over to the federal authorities before his heart gave out. The sheer immense stress of discovering his own sister and brother-in-law were stealing $12 million and risking his entire empire was undeniably what triggered his fatal heart attack. They did not just rob my husband, they effectively pushed him into an early grave. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, feeling a wave of absolute exhaustion wash over my body. The audacity of their behavior at the cemetery suddenly made perfect sense. Connor was desperate to get his hands on the master safe passcode because he knew this forensic audit existed. He needed to destroy the hard copies before the federal investigators formally raided the office. And Chloe had the absolute nerve to stand in the freezing rain looking down her nose at me, calling me a gold digger when she was the one actively participating in a $12 million heist against her own flesh and blood. I told Jamal we had everything we needed to destroy them. We had the concrete proof of the fraud. We had the fake invoices and the state registration papers tying Chloe and Connor directly to the stolen money. I said I was going to take these files straight to my lawyer first thing in the morning and let the federal government handle the rest of the toxic Washington family. But Jamal did not look relieved or triumphant. Instead, his face was completely drained of color, looking paler than a ghost. He was staring intensely at the bottom of the finalized vendor approval forms. His hand reached out slowly, and his trembling index finger pointed to a specific section of the legal paperwork. He whispered my name in a voice so quiet and terrified I barely heard it over the sound of the rain violently lashing against the floor-to-ceiling office windows. He said, "Nia, you really need to look at the secondary authorization signatures on these wire transfers." I frowned and leaned closer to the desk, adjusting the brass lamp to shine directly on the signature lines at the bottom of the page. Connor, as the chief financial officer, had obviously signed off on the massive payments. But according to company policy, any corporate transfer over $1 million required a mandatory secondary signature from the board of directors to clear the bank. I fully expected to see a forged version of Marcus' signature. I expected to see that Connor had perfectly copied my husband's handwriting to forcefully push the theft through the financial system. But the signature on the secondary authorization line did not belong to Marcus. It was not a sloppy forgery at all. It was a perfectly legitimate sweeping cursive signature written in expensive blue ink. My breath caught sharply in my throat, and the entire room seemed to suddenly spin wildly out of control. The name signed on every single fraudulent authorization approving the outright theft of $12 million was Diane Washington, my mother-in-law. The woman who constantly preached about family loyalty and protecting the bloodline had co-signed everything. I stared at the pristine blue ink of Diane's signature, and the remaining strength completely drained from my legs. I stumbled backward and slumped heavily into the massive leather executive chair behind Marcus's desk. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably, causing the thick authorization forms to shake violently in my grip. Diane Washington, the self-proclaimed protector of the family bloodline, the woman who had just looked me in the eye at the cemetery and told me I was nothing but a temporary wife, had actively helped her daughter and son-in-law steal $12 million from her own son. The sheer level of depravity was almost too heavy to comprehend. She had literally signed off on the financial ruin of her own child just to keep Chloe dripping in luxury designer brands and to keep Connor feeling like a powerful corporate mastermind. She had allowed them to break Marcus's heart and destroy his life work while smiling in his face at every single Sunday dinner. But the horrors hidden inside that biometric wall safe were far from over. As I sat there trying to process the catastrophic magnitude of my mother-in-law's betrayal, Jamal reached back into the steel vault. He pulled out another thick file, this one bound with heavy black industrial clips and labeled high-risk corporate liabilities. He placed it gently on the desk in front of me, as if he was handing me a live explosive device. I forced myself to sit up straight, wipe my eyes, and open the thick black cover. Inside was a massive stack of aggressively leveraged commercial loan agreements. My professional appraiser training immediately kicked in as I analyzed the complex financial terms. These were not standard business loans from reputable commercial banks. They were extremely high-interest junk loans, secured through shadow lenders and predatory private equity firms. These were the exact kind of toxic financial agreements that could instantly bankrupt a company and result in severe federal criminal charges if the borrowed funds were ever misappropriated. According to the paperwork, Washington Freight had borrowed an additional $8 million against its existing warehouse properties over the last 6 months alone. The capital was supposedly secured to expand our Midwestern trucking routes, but the routing numbers showed the funds had immediately been transferred into the very same shell companies Connor and Chloe secretly controlled. I turned to the final page of the largest loan agreement to see who had authorized such a catastrophic financial risk. Any loan of this massive size required a personal guarantor, someone who would be held legally and criminally responsible if the money vanished. My eyes locked onto the guarantor's signature line at the bottom of the page, and my heart completely stopped beating in my chest. There, right next to the printed date, was my name, Nia Washington. But it was not my handwriting. It was a flawless, meticulous forgery of my signature. I grabbed the next commercial loan contract and frantically flipped to the back page. My signature was on that one, too. I desperately tore through the entire stack of liability documents, spreading them across the mahogany desk. Every single high-risk loan, every single fraudulent line of credit, and every single toxic financial guarantee had my forged signature stamped at the very bottom. They had even managed to attach my personal real estate license number to the guarantor forms, giving the documents a terrifying illusion of absolute authenticity. The air was suddenly sucked out of the room. A wave of profound, paralyzing nausea washed over me as the true, sinister nature of their master plan finally clicked into perfect, terrifying clarity. Connor and Chloe were not just stealing money from the company. They were deliberately and systematically building a massive airtight paper trail that pointed directly at me. As the chief financial officer, Connor knew exactly how federal criminal audits worked. He knew that when the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation finally came knocking, they would follow the signatures on the debt. By forging my name on the junk loan documents that funded the shell companies, they were positioning me as the sole mastermind behind the entire multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. They were setting me up to be the ultimate fall guy. If the federal investigators raided the office tomorrow, Connor would simply throw his hands up and play the role of the innocent accountant. He would claim that the grieving widow had secretly leveraged the company into bankruptcy to fund her own illicit activities. Diane would undoubtedly testify against me, confirming their vicious lies to protect her golden child, Chloe. They fully intended to frame me for massive corporate fraud, let the federal government arrest me, and watch me go to federal prison for the next 20 years, while they walked away with millions of dollars in stolen clean cash. They wanted to strip me of my husband, my company, my reputation, and my basic human freedom all in one fatal, devastating blow. Jamal was reading the forged documents over my shoulder, and I could hear his breathing turn into rapid, shallow gasps of absolute panic. He backed away from the desk, running his trembling hands nervously over his head. "Oh my God. Nia," he panicked, his voice echoing loudly in the dark and silent office. "They are going to frame you. They are going to send you to federal prison. Connor is going to blame all of this missing money on you, and Diane will back him up in court. We have to call the police right now. We cannot wait another second." Jamal frantically dug his cell phone out of his jacket pocket, his fingers shaking violently as he pulled up the dialing screen. He told me we needed to call the authorities immediately and hand over every single document in this safe. He said we had the definitive proof that Connor forged my name, and we had the undeniable proof of Diane's involvement in the wire transfers. He pleaded with me to let him make the call before Connor realized we had breached the hidden server and sent corporate security to the office to physically stop us. He was terrified for my life, and he was terrified that he would be implicated simply for knowing about the hidden safe. I looked down at the meticulously forged signature bearing my name. I thought about the 8 years of blood, sweat, and tears I poured into building this logistics empire from the ground up. I thought about Chloe blocking my path in the freezing cemetery rain, calling me a pathetic gold digger. I thought about Connor demanding the keys to my husband's car while he was literally standing on his fresh grave. And I thought about Diane cruelly weaponizing my inability to have children just hours ago to make me feel entirely worthless. The profound shock and the sickening nausea completely evaporated from my body, leaving behind nothing but pure freezing, calculated anger. I reached out across the desk and firmly pushed Jamal's phone down, resting my hand on his trembling wrist. I looked up at him, and my eyes were completely cold and void of any fear. "No, Jamal," I said, my voice steady and dangerously quiet. "We are not calling the police. Handing them over to the authorities right now is way too easy. They want to play ruthless corporate warfare and completely destroy my life. Fine. But federal prison is too easy for them. I am going to let them burn it all down themselves." I turned my attention away from Jamal's horrified face and reached back into the cold steel cavity of the biometric wall safe. There had to be a reason Marcus kept these specific documents separated from the rest of the corporate files. My fingers brushed against the cold metal floor of the vault, and I felt something thick and heavy pushed all the way to the very back corner. It was a heavy-duty fireproof security envelope sealed tightly with red tamper-evident tape. I pulled it out and set it gently on the mahogany desk right next to the massive pile of Connor's forged junk loan agreements. I broke the security seal and pulled out a stack of crisp, thick parchment paper. The very first thing I saw was a signature at the bottom of the page. It was Marcus' real signature. The elegant, deliberate, sweeping cursive that I had seen on 1,000 birthday cards and anniversary notes. The absolute stark contrast between his genuine handwriting and the sloppy, frantic forgery Connor had created was immediately obvious. Just seeing his real handwriting made my chest ache with a fresh wave of grief, but I forced myself to focus on the heavy legal text printed above his name. It was a last will and testament, dated exactly 3 months ago. I scanned the first few paragraphs, and my brow furrowed in deep confusion. According to this legally binding document, Marcus explicitly left his entire 80% ownership stake in Washington Freight directly to his mother Diane and his sister Chloe. He also left them the primary corporate accounts and the massive commercial vehicle fleet. I looked up at Jamal, completely stunned. I could not understand why my brilliant husband would willingly hand over his entire logistics empire to the exact people who were actively destroying it. But as I turned to the second document in the fireproof envelope, the sheer absolute genius of my husband's final strategy hit me like a freight train. Attached to the new will was a massive, heavily notarized legal document titled Irrevocable Living Trust. As a commercial property appraiser, I dealt with complex financial estate planning all the time. I knew exactly how powerful an irrevocable trust was in the eyes of the federal government. Once a person transfers their assets into an irrevocable trust, they completely surrender their legal ownership of those assets. The trust itself becomes an entirely separate legal entity. That means the assets placed inside it cannot be touched by corporate bankruptcy proceedings. They cannot be seized by federal investigators auditing a corrupt company. And most importantly, they are completely shielded from any corporate creditors trying to collect on defaulted high-risk junk loans. I rapidly flipped through the asset schedules attached to the back of the trust agreement to see exactly what Marcus had locked inside this financial fortress. My jaw dropped. He had moved the deed to our primary residence completely out of the family estate. He had transferred his massive multi-million-dollar personal life insurance policy directly into the trust. And finally, he had liquidated $12 million in clean, untainted personal stock options and deposited the cash into a secure private account entirely controlled by the trust. I flipped back to the very first page to see who held the absolute power over this massive fortune. The sole legally appointed trustee and the single exclusive beneficiary of the irrevocable trust was me, Nia Washington. Tears finally spilled over my eyelashes and rolled hot down my cheeks, but they were no longer tears of despair or sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. Marcus knew. He knew absolutely everything. He had discovered Connor's massive money laundering operation and Diane's sickening betrayal months ago. But instead of confronting them and giving Connor the opportunity to destroy the evidence or flee the country, Marcus chose to stay entirely silent. He quietly endured the unbearable stress of watching his family tear his legacy apart, while he worked tirelessly behind the scenes to build an impenetrable financial wall around the woman he loved. He knew the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were closing in on the shell companies. He knew that when the federal hammer finally fell, Washington Freight would be completely buried under millions of dollars in fraudulent debt and federal criminal fines. By rewriting his will and leaving the company's shares entirely to Diane and Chloe, he was not giving them a multi-million-dollar empire. He was legally handing them the anchor to a sinking ship. He was making them the primary majority shareholders of a massive criminal liability. When the federal agents raided the building, Diane and Chloe would be left holding the bag for every single forged document and every single stolen dime. Connor thought he was an absolute mastermind by forging my signature on those junk loans to make me the fall guy. But his entire vicious plan was completely useless. The assets Connor was trying to steal from the estate were not even in the estate anymore. They legally bypassed probate court entirely because they belonged to my irrevocable trust. Marcus had successfully outsmarted his arrogant brother-in-law from beyond the grave. Jamal was reading the trust documents over my arm, and he let out a loud breath of pure disbelief. He told me that Marcus was a genuine visionary. Jamal said Marcus made sure you would be completely untouchable, and that his toxic family would get exactly what they deserved. The sheer relief in Jamal's voice was palpable. We did not need to run to the police like terrified victims. We just needed to sit back and let the arrogant Washington family proudly claim their worthless, poisoned inheritance. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the dark office was broken by a sharp, loud chime. My cell phone vibrated aggressively on the polished wood surface of the desk. The bright blue light from the digital screen illuminated the dark room, casting harsh shadows across the scattered documents. I picked up the phone and looked at the notification banner on the lock screen. It was a text message from Connor. I swiped the screen open and read the short, demanding sentence he had just sent me at 2:00 in the morning. The message read, "Family meeting at 9 in the morning, sharp at the main estate for the official will reading. My private lawyer will be handling the transition. Do not be late, Nia, and do not make this harder than it has to be." Connor was setting the stage for his grand performance. He likely had a completely fake will drawn up by his sleazy private attorney, ready to force me out of the family with absolutely nothing. He wanted to humiliate me in front of Diane and Chloe. He wanted to watch me break down and beg them for a meager settlement while he proudly played the wealthy corporate savior. He truly believed he held all the winning cards in his hand. I looked down at the genuine, irrevocable trust document resting safely in my hands. I thought about the $12 million of clean money legally locked away under my name and the massive criminal federal investigation hanging right over Connor's arrogant head. I carefully folded the real documents and placed them securely inside my leather purse. I wiped the tears from my face and turned to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the dark, rainy Chicago skyline. I let out a low, dark chuckle that echoed in the empty room. I smiled bitterly into the darkness and said, "See you tomorrow, Connor." The bright morning sun over the wealthy Chicago suburbs felt entirely out of place given the heavy dark secrets I now carried in my purse. I pulled my car through the massive wrought iron gates of the sprawling Washington family estate. The manicured green lawns and the perfectly trimmed hedges stood in sharp contrast to the damp, muddy cemetery we had stood in just yesterday afternoon. I parked my car on the sweeping circular driveway right next to Connor's brand new imported silver sports car. I turned off the engine and took a deep, steadying breath. I patted the side of my designer leather purse, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of my husband's genuine, irrevocable trust resting safely inside. I stepped out of the car and walked confidently up the grand stone steps toward the heavy double oak front doors. The door was unlocked, so I pushed it open and stepped into the massive marble foyer. The entire house smelled of expensive catered pastries and fresh tropical floral arrangements. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the scent of wet earth and morning that still lingered in my memory. As I walked slowly down the long, polished hallway, I heard the unmistakable sharp clink of crystal glasses, followed immediately by high-pitched, joyous laughter echoing from the formal living room. I stopped in the grand arched doorway and took in the scene before me. The living room was bathed in warm, golden morning sunlight pouring through the massive bay windows. The vibrant colors of the plush velvet furniture, the expensive abstract artwork on the walls, and the blooming orchids felt almost aggressively cheerful. It was a space perfectly designed for a celebration. And a celebration was exactly what was happening. There was absolutely no sign of mourning in this room. The black designer funeral clothes they wore yesterday were completely gone. Diane was lounging casually on the central emerald green velvet sofa, wearing a vibrant silk morning gown. She held a crystal flute filled to the brim with expensive sparkling champagne. Chloe was perched on the edge of a matching armchair, wearing bright white designer loungewear. She was vigorously tapping away on her latest tablet, looking incredibly excited as she babbled about hiring a private contractor to remodel her summer house. Connor was standing proudly by the ornate marble fireplace, pouring himself a generous glass of expensive amber scotch, even though it was barely 9:00 in the morning. He wore a crisp, light blue tailored suit with his legs casually crossed at the ankles, looking incredibly smug and entirely too comfortable in my husband's childhood home. He looked up and caught my eye, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his drink before flashing me a wide, predatory smile. They looked like a family who had just won the ultimate lottery, not a family who had just buried their son and brother less than 24 hours ago. They fully expected me to walk into that room with red, puffy eyes, a trembling voice, and a broken spirit. They expected a terrified, grieving widow, completely desperate for their financial charity and guidance. Instead, I walked into the room wearing a sharp-tailored navy blue business suit, with my hair perfectly styled and my makeup flawlessly applied. I stood tall, completely unbothered, holding my purse firmly at my side. The laughter in the room immediately died down as Diane and Chloe finally noticed my presence in the doorway. Diane slowly lowered her champagne flute and looked me up and down with obvious deep disdain. She asked me why I was dressed like I was heading to a ruthless corporate board meeting instead of properly respecting the solemn mourning period of her beloved son. I almost laughed out loud at the absolute staggering hypocrisy of her statement while she was literally drinking champagne and celebrating. I kept my face entirely neutral and calmly replied that I had highly important corporate business to attend to later today. I asked them to skip the fake pleasantries and get straight to the point of this mandatory family meeting. Chloe rolled her eyes loudly and tossed her tablet onto the coffee table. She muttered that I was always so rigid and obsessed with work, just like a cold, heartless machine. She told me I should be grateful they even invited me to the house today, considering I had no real biological ties to the family legacy. I completely ignored her childish bait and kept my eyes locked directly on Connor. Connor chuckled darkly and walked slowly over to the large mahogany coffee table, placing his scotch glass down with a heavy thud. He gestured toward a man sitting quietly in the far corner of the room, whom I had not immediately noticed. The man was wearing a cheap, shiny gray suit that fit him poorly around the shoulders. He had slicked back, thinning hair, a nervous sweat on his brow, and a battered leather briefcase resting awkwardly on his lap. He looked absolutely nothing like the prestigious, high-powered corporate attorneys Marcus usually retained for the logistics company. Connor proudly introduced the man as Richard Vance, claiming he was a highly specialized private estate attorney. Connor boasted that he had personally hired Richard to help the family navigate the complicated legal transition of the corporate assets and the personal estate. He said the sudden tragic nature of Marcus' passing required someone who could act swiftly, quietly, and decisively to protect the Washington bloodline from any unnecessary external interference. Connor heavily emphasized the word external, while staring directly into my eyes, making sure I knew exactly who he meant by that insult. I looked closely at Richard Vance and immediately recognized the exact type of lawyer he was. He was a bottom-feeding legal mercenary, the kind of desperate attorney who would happily forge documents, backdate contracts, and completely bend the law as long as the retainer check cleared the bank. He nervously adjusted his cheap tie under my intense, unblinking scrutiny, completely avoiding direct eye contact with me. I did not say a single word to him. I simply walked over to the only empty chair in the room, sat down gracefully, crossed my legs, and waited for their elaborate theatrical performance to officially begin. Diane took another slow sip of her champagne and sighed dramatically, feigning a look of deep maternal sorrow that completely failed to reach her cold, calculating eyes. She told me that Marcus was always so unpredictable and that he had been under a tremendous amount of stress lately. She lied straight to my face, saying that in his final weeks, he had finally realized the absolute importance of keeping the family empire under strict biological control. She said he wanted to make sure his blood relatives were financially protected above all else. Connor nodded in solemn agreement, expertly playing the role of the devoted and responsible son-in-law. He turned to the sleazy attorney and gave him a sharp, demanding nod of approval, signaling him to start the show. Richard Vance nervously cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing as he popped the brass latches on his leather briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a crisp white document folder, placing it carefully on his lap. He looked directly at me, his voice slightly trembling under the sudden heavy silence of the living room. He said we have found Marcus, most recently updated, will signed right before his tragic passing. Richard Vance smoothed out the crisp white pages of the document with his sweaty palms. He cleared his throat again, sounding completely parched. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded neatly in my lap, maintaining direct and unyielding eye contact with him. I wanted him to feel the heavy, crushing weight of the massive fraud he was actively participating in. I wanted him to know that I was not a terrified, grieving widow, completely ignorant of the law. I was a professional, and I was watching his every single move. Richard began reading the document in a rapid, monotonous voice, trying to get through the heavy legal jargon as fast as humanly possible. He read the standard opening declaration stating that Marcus was of sound mind and body, and that this specific document officially revoked any and all previous wills, testaments, and estate plans. According to Richard, this new document had been drafted, finalized, and witnessed just 3 days before my husband's fatal heart attack. I glanced over at Connor. He was leaning casually against the ornate marble fireplace, swirling the amber scotch in his crystal glass, with a deeply arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had just pulled off the perfect unstoppable crime. Richard flipped to the second page, his voice trembling slightly as he reached the division of the major corporate assets. He announced that effective immediately, a full 80% of the controlling shares of Washington Freight and Investment were to be transferred directly to Diane Washington and Chloe Washington. They were to hold joint and absolute controlling interest over all corporate operations, all massive warehouse facilities, and the entire commercial transportation fleet spanning the Midwest. I watched Diane as the lawyer read her name. She took another slow, celebratory sip of her expensive champagne. She gave a small, solemn nod, acting as if she was bravely accepting a heavy, tragic burden instead of gleefully stealing a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. Chloe, on the other hand, did not even try to hide her absolute sheer delight. She actually squealed a high-pitched sound of pure joy and clapped her manicured hands together, completely dropping the mourning sister act she had put on at the cemetery. But Richard was not finished. He continued reading rapidly down the extensive list of stolen assets. The primary residential estate, the massive custom-built home where Marcus and I had lived and planned to raise a family, was also being entirely transferred back to Diane. The luxury vehicles, the offshore corporate investment accounts, and the highly lucrative commercial properties that I had personally appraised and secured for the company were all swept directly into the biological bloodline. They were systematically stripping away every single piece of the life and financial security I had built over the last 8 years. According to this fabricated piece of paper, my entire existence alongside Marcus was being completely erased from the public record. The sunny living room grew deathly quiet as Richard finally reached the very last page of the legal document. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting nervously over to Connor for reassurance. Connor gave him a sharp, impatient nod, silently commanding him to finish the brutal execution. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his cheap collar, and read the final designated clause. He stated that in recognition of my time as Marcus' wife, the estate was prepared to offer me a one-time lump sum payment of exactly $50,000 in cash. $50,000. I sat there letting the absolute sheer audacity of that number wash over me. I had personally handed Marcus $85,000 in cash from my own life savings just to sign the lease on his very first warehouse. I had brought in millions of dollars in commercial real estate equity through my direct professional network, and they were offering me a $50,000 severance package, like a dismissed entry-level employee being quietly pushed out the back door. It was not just a massive financial robbery. It was a calculated, deliberate, and vicious humiliation designed to completely break my spirit and put me in my place. But Richard quickly raised a shaking index finger, signaling that there was a massive, non-negotiable catch to this insulting monetary offer. He stammered slightly as he explained the strict ironclad legal conditions attached to the money. He said the $50,000 would only be formally released to my personal bank account upon the immediate signing of a comprehensive legal waiver. I kept my voice entirely flat and devoid of any emotion as I asked him to clarify exactly what that waiver entailed. Richard looked down at his papers, refusing to meet my eyes. He explained that I had to sign a binding non-disclosure agreement and a complete permanent waiver of all asset claims. I had to legally forfeit any and all rights to contest the will, demand an independent corporate audit, or make any future legal claims against Washington Freight and the Washington family estate in perpetuity. Everything suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense in my mind. This was the absolute final piece of Connor's malicious puzzle. He did not just want to steal the company out from under me. He needed to legally neutralize me to save his own skin. If I signed that waiver, I would be permanently locked out of the corporate structure forever. I would have absolutely no legal standing to request financial records, look at the corporate server, or challenge the massive toxic junk loans he had taken out using my perfectly forged signature. By forcing me to sign away my basic rights for a pathetic $50,000, they were permanently sealing the federal trap. When the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation finally raided the company and found the massive debt and the wire fraud tied directly to my name, I would not be able to prove my innocence because I would have legally surrendered all my rights to the corporate defense resources. I would have no legal access to the files proving the fraud. They were literally buying my total silence, my ultimate destruction, and my future federal prison sentence for $50,000. I looked around at the three of them sitting in that bright sunlit living room, Diane holding her champagne glass like a reigning queen, Chloe with her arrogant, entitled sneer already planning how to spend the money, Connor with his smug, predatory smile acting like the brilliant mastermind who had successfully conquered the entire family. They honestly thought I was a terrified, vulnerable widow who would eagerly snatch up their financial breadcrumbs just to survive the month. They thought their aggressive intimidation tactics and their carefully orchestrated legal theater had completely broken me down to nothing. Connor pushed himself off the marble fireplace and walked slowly toward the center of the room, his expensive leather shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. He reached inside his tailored light blue suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. He took the thick legal waiver from Richard's trembling hands and placed it squarely on the polished mahogany coffee table. He leaned over the table, his cold, pale eyes locking onto mine with absolute aggressive authority. Connor slowly slid the thick stack of paper and the expensive fountain pen across the smooth marble surface, stopping right in front of me. The heavy, solid gold fountain pen rolled to a stop precisely 1 inch from my neatly folded hands. Connor leaned forward, placing both of his palms flat on the polished marble coffee table. He loomed over me intentionally, using his tall frame to block out the warm morning sunlight streaming through the bay windows. From his perspective, looking down at me seated in the chair, I was supposed to look small, intimidated, and completely powerless. He wanted me to feel the full crushing weight of his supposed authority. He wanted me to cower under the gaze of the wealthy corporate executive who had successfully conquered my family. I kept my chin level and my eyes locked dead onto his pale blue eyes. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the pen. Connor let out a long, heavy sigh, shaking his head slowly, like a disappointed father dealing with a particularly stubborn and irrational child. He stood up straight and unbuttoned his light blue tailored suit jacket, resting one hand casually in his pocket. He looked around the vibrant living room, briefly making eye contact with Diane and Chloe, who were watching the exchange with absolute glee. He was putting on a spectacular performance for his audience, playing the role of the benevolent genius, trying to reason with an emotional widow. "Look, Nia," he began, his voice dropping an octave into a sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone. "I know you are grieving. I know the sudden loss of Marcus has completely clouded your judgment and made it impossible for you to think clearly about the future. Corporate logistics and high-level asset management are incredibly complex beasts. This is a ruthless, high-stakes environment, and frankly, it is entirely out of your depth." He took a slow, deliberate step closer to my chair, invading my personal space. Marcus knew he was leaving behind a massive, complicated mess, Connor lied smoothly, without a single ounce of hesitation. Before his tragic heart attack, he came to me begging for my help to restructure the company. He knew his biological family needed immediate financial protection, and he trusted me to step in and make the hard choices that you simply do not have the stomach or the education to handle. I sat there listening to this mediocre man confidently rewrite the history of the company I built. I thought about the 6 fraudulent shell companies he had secretly created. I thought about the massive toxic junk loans he had illegally secured using my forged signature. He was standing right in front of me, wearing a custom suit, bought with stolen money, actively trying to convince me that my brilliant, hardworking husband was incompetent and that he, the thief, was the ultimate savior. His massive white savior complex was fully on display, radiating from every single word he spoke. He truly believed that simply because of his gender and his race, he was naturally entitled to the empire we had created. Connor picked up his crystal glass of scotch from the mantel and took a slow, arrogant sip. He pointed a finger at the stack of legal waivers sitting on the marble table. That $50,000 is a gift, Nia. It is a massive generosity provided to you out of the sheer goodness of my heart, because Diane and Chloe asked me to be kind to you. But make no mistake, this is a one-time courtesy offer. He leaned back down, bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. A cold, predatory smile stretched across his face, completely dropping his fake, sympathetic facade. Us white folks have a saying in business, Nia, he whispered, his voice dripping with condescending venom. Cut your losses. Take the 50 grand and walk. You do not have the money or the brains to sue my legal team. He let the racist, misogynistic insult hang heavily in the quiet air of the living room. He wanted me to feel utterly worthless. He wanted me to internalize the lie that I was nothing more than an uneducated black woman who got lucky by marrying a successful man. You see, Naya? He continued, proudly gesturing toward Richard Vance, the sweating legal mercenary sitting in the corner. Richard is just the messenger. The actual legal team I have on retainer for Washington Freight consists of the most aggressive and highly paid corporate litigators in the entire state of Illinois. They eat emotional, grieving widows for breakfast. If you refuse to sign that waiver today and decide you want to contest this perfectly legal will, I will immediately freeze your personal banking accounts using a corporate injunction. I will drag you through years of grueling, expensive litigation. I will personally make sure the legal fees completely bankrupt you. And when you are living on the street with absolutely nothing, I will make a few phone calls and ensure your commercial real estate appraisal license is permanently revoked in this city. Connor took another step back, looking incredibly pleased with his horrific threats. So I highly suggest you pick up that gold pen sign on the dotted line and take the $50,000. Go buy yourself a nice, quiet little life somewhere far away from our family. Chloe let out a sharp, cruel laugh from her velvet armchair. You really should listen to him, Nia, she chimed in, taking another sip of her morning champagne. 50 grand is more than enough for you to put a down payment on a tiny little apartment in one of those bad neighborhoods you are so familiar with. You can go back to living exactly how you lived before my brother took pity on you. Diane nodded in absolute agreement, giving Connor a look of profound maternal pride. He really is looking out for your best interests, dear Diane said falsely, her voice coated in sweet poison. Be a good, smart girl, and take the money before Connor decides to completely withdraw the offer. You have caused this family enough stress for 1 week. I sat perfectly motionless in my chair, letting their toxic words wash over me like water off a stone. I analyzed Connor's body language with absolute clinical precision. Despite his grand, arrogant threats and his booming, confident voice, I noticed the tiny beads of sweat forming along his hairline. I noticed how tightly his fingers gripped his heavy crystal glass. He was putting on a terrifying show, but underneath the expensive suit he was deeply frantic. He needed my signature on that waiver today. He was desperate for me to legally surrender my rights because he knew that without that signed document, his entire master plan to frame me for his $12 million federal wire fraud would completely fall apart. He thought he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He thought his intimidation tactics had paralyzed me with fear. But Connor made the ultimate fatal mistake. He vastly underestimated the intelligence of the woman sitting quietly in front of him. I looked down at the heavy, solid gold fountain pen resting on the polished marble. I did not reach out my hand to pick it up. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or scream at the blatant racism and disrespect they had just hurled at me. Instead, I looked slowly up at Connor, and a cold, sharp smile formed on my lips. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a smile that immediately made the arrogant smirk falter on his pale face. "You really think you have thought of absolutely everything, do you not?" "Connor?" I asked, my voice smooth, calm, and echoing with undeniable authority. "You really think you can sit there and play the grand mastermind?" I reached down and brought my black designer leather purse onto my lap. I did not reach for the heavy fireproof envelope containing my husband's genuine irrevocable trust. It was way too early to drop the ultimate bomb. I wanted to systematically dismantle his arrogant ego piece by piece. I wanted to watch him bleed out his false confidence right in front of the family he claimed to rule. I slowly unzipped the top compartment of my purse, holding Connor's anxious gaze the entire time. I reached my hand inside and deliberately bypassed the legal paperwork. Instead, my fingers closed around a small, sleek, metallic object. I pulled my hand out and placed the silver object gently onto the marble coffee table right next to his fake legal waiver. It was a small silver universal serial bus drive, a simple piece of digital technology that contained the absolute destruction of his entire fake empire. Connor stared down at the small silver flash drive resting against the pristine white paper of the legal waiver. For a brief second, a flicker of genuine confusion crossed his arrogant features before he quickly masked it with a dismissive scoff. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, completely unbothered. He clearly thought the drive contained nothing more than sentimental family photos, or perhaps a desperate spreadsheet of my personal expenses that I was going to use to beg for a slightly larger settlement. He shook his head and let out a short, condescending laugh. Chloe, however, completely lost her patience. She saw me sitting there, refusing to pick up the gold fountain pen, and interpreted my deliberate silence as fearful hesitation. She threw her hands up in the air, her heavy gold bracelets clanking loudly together. "What is this, Nia?" she demanded, her voice shrill and echoing off the high ceilings. "Are you seriously trying to stall right now? Do you think pulling out some pathetic little prop is going to change the legal reality of this situation?" She stood up from her velvet armchair, pacing a few steps toward me with a look of absolute triumph on her face. Her eyes gleamed with a vicious, cruel delight. She was finally getting the opportunity to say every single toxic thing she had held back for the last 8 years. "You are so completely delusional," she spat, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You sit there acting so proud and defiant, but we all know the truth. Marcus was absolutely exhausted by you. Do you honestly think a man like my brother, a man building a massive corporate empire, actually wanted to be tied down to a woman who could not even give him a single heir?" I felt a sharp initial sting at her words, but my face remained an impenetrable mask of calm. Chloe noticed I was not reacting and pushed even harder, desperately trying to draw blood. "We all talked about it, Nia," she continued, her voice laced with pure poison. "Every single holiday, every single family dinner, we whispered about how pathetic it was watching you try and fail to start a family. A true legacy requires children, and you are nothing but a dead end. Marcus only stayed with you out of overwhelming pity because he knew you had absolutely nothing else in your sad little life. You failed as a wife. You failed to expand the Washington bloodline, and now you are failing to realize that your time in this family has officially expired. Take the money and leave before we decide you get absolutely nothing." The sheer toxicity radiating from Chloe was staggering, but I did not break eye contact. I sat completely still, letting her exhaust herself. Diane immediately jumped in to support her daughter, sitting up straight on the emerald green sofa and smoothing the silk fabric of her morning gown. She looked down her nose at me with an aristocratic sneer that perfectly masked her deep-rooted insecurities. "Chloe is absolutely right," Diane said, her voice cold and commanding. "We are being incredibly generous to you, Nia, and you are sitting there acting completely ungrateful. You should be down on your knees thanking us for this $50,000 settlement." Diane picked up her champagne flute and took a delicate sip, looking around her luxurious living room as if to remind me of the massive wealth gap between us. "Let us be perfectly honest about where you came from," Diane continued, her tone dripping with intense classist disgust. "You grew up in a cramped little house on the South Side. Your parents worked themselves to the bone just to keep the lights on. When Marcus brought you into this family, we elevated you. We gave you a taste of high society. We allowed you to wear designer clothes, attend exclusive charity galas, and live in a custom-built mansion that you could never have afforded on your mediocre appraiser salary." She gestured vaguely toward the front door, her diamond rings catching the morning sunlight. "You are a guest who has severely overstayed her welcome," Diane sneered. "You do not belong in this zip code, and you certainly do not belong in the executive boardrooms of Washington Freight. Take the $50,000. Pack up whatever cheap clothes you brought into my son's house and go back to the hood where you belong. Go back to your struggling little life and leave the corporate empire to the people who actually know how to manage wealth." If they had said these horrific things to me yesterday while I was standing in the freezing rain at the cemetery, I might have shattered completely. I might have cried and screamed and tried to defend my worth. But today, sitting in this bright living room, armed with the absolute truth, I felt nothing but a terrifying, heavy calm. I looked back and forth between Chloe's flushed, triumphant face and Diane's cold, condescending glare. The louder and more vicious they became, the quieter and more powerful I felt. I was watching lab rats proudly running through a maze, entirely unaware that the doors had already been locked and the building was on fire. Richard Vance. The sleazy private attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. Even a corrupt legal mercenary like him could sense the dangerous sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. He looked at me nervously, recognizing the undeniable look of a woman who was holding all the cards. Connor noticed Richard's sudden panic and frowned. He slammed his hand flat on the coffee table, making a loud cracking sound that startled both Diane and Chloe. "Enough!" Connor barked, trying to regain total control of the room. "We are not here to debate family history. This is a formal legal proceeding." He looked directly at me, his face hardening into a furious scowl. "Pick up the pen, Nia. I am done playing these stupid silent games with you. Sign the waiver right now, or I swear I will make a phone call and have my security team physically throw you off this property." I ignored his pathetic threat entirely. I smoothly uncrossed my legs and reached back into my black designer purse. "I told you to pick up the pen," Connor yelled, taking an aggressive step forward. "What are you doing?" I did not answer him. My hand emerged from the purse holding my sleek silver laptop. I placed it gently on the marble coffee table right next to the universal serial bus drive. I flipped the screen open, and the bright display instantly woke up, casting a cool white glow over the legal documents scattered across the table. Connor let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "What is this?" he demanded, spreading his arms wide. "Are you going to show us a PowerPoint presentation about your feelings? Shut that computer down, Nia. You are embarrassing yourself." I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the screen. My fingers flew across the keyboard with rapid mechanical precision. I plugged the small silver flash drive into the side port of the laptop. A small notification popped up on the screen indicating the drive was securely connected. I did not open the forensic audit files yet. I did not pull up the forged loan agreements or the state registration documents for Chloe's shell companies. That visual evidence would come soon enough. Instead, I opened a single audio file that Jamal had successfully exported from the hidden corporate server late last night. I quickly clicked into the system settings on my laptop. I knew this living room intimately because I was the one who originally designed the smart home integration for this house. I easily located the primary Bluetooth network for the massive multi-thousand-dollar surround sound speakers built seamlessly into the ceiling of the room. I clicked connect. A loud, crisp chime echoed from above, confirming my laptop was now fully paired with the living room audio system. Chloe stopped pacing and crossed her arms, looking around the ceiling in confusion. "What did you just do?" she asked, her voice dropping its confident edge. I pushed the laptop slightly away from me and leaned back in my chair, gracefully crossing my legs once again. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and finally looked directly up at Connor. His arrogant, confident smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a tight, nervous frown. The color was slowly beginning to drain from his pale face as his mind frantically tried to calculate what I was about to do. I held his terrified gaze and spoke in a voice so cold and commanding, it practically froze the air between us. "You said the company has a massive legal team, Connor," I asked, tilting my head slightly to the side. "Then how do you explain this audio recording?" I reached out and pressed the spacebar on my laptop keyboard. The pristine audio file immediately began to play, echoing with crystal-clear precision through the multi-thousand-dollar surround sound system mounted seamlessly into the ceiling. The voice that filled the room was deep, authoritative, and entirely unmistakable. It belonged to a senior executive at the commercial lending division of Bank of America. The man identified himself, clearly stating his name and his direct title. He addressed the recording directly to Marcus Washington. The banker spoke with a tone of severe professional urgency, a tone reserved exclusively for catastrophic financial emergencies. He explained that he had been trying to reach the chief financial officer for several weeks regarding multiple missed payments, but his calls had been repeatedly ignored. Then the executive read the official status of the primary corporate operating accounts. He stated that due to a highly irregular series of massive vendor wire transfers and several aggressively leveraged private equity loans, the Washington Freightmaster account was currently overdrawn. The banker explicitly listed the names of the suspicious vendors receiving the funds: Apex Logistics Solutions, Horizon Freight Management, Pinnacle Supply Chain. He noted that these accounts had drained the corporate cash reserves completely dry. He paused for a brief second before delivering the fatal blow. The executive formally announced that the primary corporate account was currently sitting at a staggering negative $8.5 million. He warned that if the massive multi-million-dollar deficit was not resolved within the next 48 hours, the bank would immediately freeze all remaining operational assets, seize the corporate real estate portfolio, and initiate formal bankruptcy proceedings against Washington Freight. I pressed the spacebar again abruptly, cutting off the audio. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. It was so incredibly quiet, I could actually hear the gentle rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing out in the hallway. I looked directly at Connor. The arrogant, confident smirk that had been plastered across his face just moments ago had been completely wiped away. His pale skin had turned an unsettling, sickly shade of chalk white, and his pale blue eyes were blown wide with pure, unadulterated panic. His jaw hung slightly open, but absolutely no words came out. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped confidently off a tall ledge and suddenly realized there was no safety net waiting for him at the bottom. The grand corporate mastermind had just been violently exposed as a pathetic, desperate fraud. I did not give him a single second to recover his composure or formulate a lie. I stood up slowly from my chair. I pushed my shoulders back and lifted my chin deliberately, taking up space in the room. For the first time since I walked into this toxic house, I was the one looking down. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted entirely, placing me in total, absolute control. I walked slowly around the marble coffee table, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Connor instinctively took a small step backward, physically retreating from my sudden dominating presence. He was no longer the tall, looming predator trying to intimidate a grieving widow. He was a cornered rat. I reached into my black leather designer purse one more time. I bypassed the irrevocable trust completely. Instead, my hands grasped the thick, heavy commercial appraisal report I had meticulously compiled late last night, using the raw data from the hidden wall safe. I pulled it out and held it high for a brief moment, letting everyone in the room see the dense, intimidating stack of financial data and colored graphs. Then I slammed it violently down onto the polished marble coffee table. The loud, sharp smack echoed like a gunshot, causing Richard Vance, the sleazy private attorney, to physically jump in his seat and clutch his leather briefcase to his chest. I leaned forward, resting both of my hands flat on the marble table, perfectly mirroring the aggressive, dominant stance Connor had taken just minutes ago. But unlike Connor, I actually had the absolute, undeniable truth backing my authority. I told them to look very closely at the numbers printed on the front page of that report. I let my voice ring out with cold, lethal clarity, breaking down the complex financial reality so that even Chloe could understand it. I explained that Connor had been quietly securing massive toxic junk loans against the company warehouse properties. I told him he bypassed the traditional banking system and went to shadow lenders who charged astronomical interest rates. He took that borrowed money and wired it directly to a network of fraudulent shell companies that he had secretly created. He had been intentionally bleeding the corporate accounts dry for 2 straight years, using fake construction invoices and phantom consulting fees to cover his tracks. I looked at Connor and let out a dark, mocking laugh. I threw his racist, condescending insult right back in his face. "You told me that us white folks have a saying in business about cutting your losses, Connor. Well, I have a saying for you too. You cannot steal what is already gone. You spent the last 2 years parading around this family acting like the brilliant white savior who was going to single-handedly modernize a black-owned logistics company. You demanded absolute respect from Marcus. You demanded a massive executive salary, but you have absolutely no real talent. You are just a parasite who drained the host completely dry." I pointed a manicured finger directly at his chest, watching him physically flinch under my intense gaze. I told him he was an absolute fool for thinking he had won the ultimate prize today. "You did not inherit a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, Connor," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that commanded the entire room. "You hijacked an empty shell waiting for bankruptcy. The 80% ownership stake you so proudly forced Richard to read out loud is not an asset. It is a massive, catastrophic liability. You and this greedy family just officially inherited $8.5 million of inescapable toxic corporate debt." Chloe sat completely frozen in her bright white designer loungewear. Her mouth was opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water, but her brain could simply not process the terrifying reality of the situation. She looked frantically over at her husband, expecting him to laugh it off and call me a desperate liar. She expected him to pull out another magical legal document and fix everything just like he always promised he would. But Connor just stood there completely paralyzed, staring blankly down at the thick financial report resting on the table. The silence stretched on, suffocating them in the reality of their own incredible greed. He knew I had him completely cornered, with nowhere left to run. But it was Diane who finally broke the unbearable silence. The terrifying reality of the negative $8.5 million finally pierced straight through her thick, impenetrable wall of aristocratic denial. She realized that her luxurious lifestyle, her designer gowns, and her precious social standing were completely evaporating into thin air. Her hand began to shake violently. The crystal champagne flute slipped straight through her trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces and sending expensive, sparkling wine splashing all over the rare imported rug. Diane did not even flinch at the loud sound of the breaking glass. She slowly turned her head toward her beloved son-in-law. Her carefully applied makeup could not hide the sudden, terrifying realization stretching across her aging face. She grabbed the sleeve of his tailored light blue suit, pulling him roughly toward her with a desperate, frantic strength. "What is she talking about, Connor?" Diane demanded, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "Where is our cash?" Connor violently yanked his arm out of Diane's desperate grip. He stumbled backward, almost tripping over the thick edge of the imported rug. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, but his palms were visibly slick with nervous sweat. "Diane, please, you have to calm down," he stammered, his voice pitching an octave higher than his usual confident baritone. "The banker is completely exaggerating the situation. It is just a temporary liquidity crisis. We have massive corporate receivables currently tied up in escrow. I am simply moving operational assets around to cover the quarterly margins. It is standard high-level corporate finance." I did not let him spin another pathetic lie. "There are no receivables in escrow, Connor," I stated loudly, my voice cutting through his desperate excuses like a freshly sharpened blade. I opened the thick commercial appraisal report resting on the marble coffee table and flipped directly to the second section, pointing to a massive spreadsheet printed entirely in bright red ink. I looked directly at Diane, who was currently shaking violently in the center of her luxurious living room. "Your brilliant son-in-law decided to play real estate tycoon with Marcus, hard-earned operating capital," I explained. "Let us review his incredible business acumen." 12 months ago, Connor authorized the outright purchase of a massive abandoned manufacturing plant on the industrial South Side. He convinced Marcus it could be easily retrofitted into a Class A commercial fulfillment center. But Connor, in his infinite corporate wisdom, completely bypassed the mandatory Phase 1 environmental site assessment to save a few $1,000s on initial consulting fees. I turned my cold, unyielding gaze back to Connor, watching his throat bob as he swallowed hard. "You thought you knew better than the local commercial appraisers, did you not, Connor? You bought a toxic wasteland. The soil beneath that warehouse was severely contaminated with decades of industrial chemical runoff. The city planning department immediately hit the property with a massive environmental stop work order. You sank $4 million of clean corporate cash into a property that has a current market value of absolutely zero. The capitalization rate is entirely non-existent. The property is legally condemned, and you are currently paying massive municipal fines just to own a pile of toxic dirt." Connor opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely nothing came out. I flipped to the next page outlining his disastrous vehicle acquisitions. "Let us talk about the fleet expansion," I continued relentlessly. "You bought 50 commercial transport trucks from a bankrupt supplier in Ohio, thinking you secured a master wholesale deal. But you failed to run a basic mechanical depreciation analysis. Half the transport fleet broke down within the first 90 days of operation. The maintenance capital expenditures skyrocketed, completely wiping out the quarterly logistics profit margin. You pushed the company debt service coverage ratio so far below 1.0 that the business was literally borrowing high-interest money just to pay the monthly interest on your previous toxic loans." I stepped around the coffee table, closing the physical distance between us, forcing him to look me dead in the eye. "You strutted into this house every single Sunday wearing your expensive tailored suits, looking down your nose at a hard-working black family. You patted my husband on the back, calling him the creative idea guy, while proudly appointing yourself the absolute financial mastermind. You constantly threw around meaningless corporate buzzwords like supply chain synergy and vertical integration to make yourself sound vastly superior. You really believed you were the sophisticated white corporate savior descending from the heavens to rescue a naive, disorganized black business. You genuinely believed that because we did not have your fancy country club background, we could not possibly understand your sophisticated financial maneuvering." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a lethal whisper that commanded the entire room. "But the terrifying reality, Connor, is that you are just incredibly mediocre. You are a completely incompetent businessman who destroyed a highly profitable logistics empire in less than 2 years, because your massive, fragile ego is infinitely larger than your actual intelligence." Chloe stood up from her velvet armchair, her hands trembling wildly in front of her. "No," she whispered, shaking her blonde hair in fierce, frantic denial. "Connor went to a top-tier business school. He knows exactly what he is doing. You are just manipulating these numbers to make him look bad because you are jealous of his success. He went to a top-tier business school and learned exactly how to commit federal wire fraud." Chloe, I shot back instantly, silencing her desperate defense. When his terrible commercial investments completely drained the legitimate corporate accounts, he panicked. He realized the board of directors would immediately fire him for gross financial negligence. So instead of acting like a man and admitting his catastrophic failures, he doubled down and broke federal law. He set up your 6 fraudulent shell companies. He generated fake invoices for logistics consulting that never actually happened. He used those shadow equity loans to kite funds back and forth across state lines, artificially inflating the quarterly earnings reports to make it look like the company was still highly profitable. He was running a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme right inside your brother's corporate ledger, just to hide the absolute sheer embarrassment of his own professional incompetence. I watched the absolute devastation wash over Connor's face. His professional facade had not just slipped, it had completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. His light blue tailored suit suddenly looked baggy and pathetic, hanging off his slumping shoulders. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his chest heaving with sheer, uncontrollable panic. He darted his pale eyes wildly around the sunlit living room, desperately searching for an exit, a lifeline, or a sympathetic face. But there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. I had meticulously laid his professional incompetence and his criminal behavior completely bare for his wife and his mother-in-law to see. The profound, crushing humiliation of being exposed as a desperate fraud was breaking him down right in front of my eyes. Diane let out a guttural, high-pitched sound of pure anguish. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire aristocratic identity and her massive fortune burn completely to the ground. She lunged forward and struck Connor hard in the chest with both of her open palms. "You stole my son's money," she screamed, her voice tearing with raw, unfiltered fury. "You ruined us. You stood in my house and promised me we would be protected, and you bankrupted my entire family." Connor stumbled backward from the unexpected physical force of Diane's strike, hitting his back hard against the ornate marble fireplace. He held his hands up defensively, his face suddenly twisting into a furious, desperate snarl. The polite corporate mask was completely gone, replaced by the vicious cornered animal underneath. He pointed a shaking, sweat-slicked finger directly at my face, his eyes bulging with manic desperation. "Stop lying, you manipulative bitch!" he roared, spit flying from his trembling lips. "I did not do this alone. Do not stand there and act like Marcus was some innocent victim in all of this. Marcus knew exactly what was happening with those accounts. He signed off on every single one of those papers." I did not yell. I did not scream to defend my dead husband's honor. I simply reached back into my purse and pulled out the thick black industrial folder I had retrieved from the wall safe. I walked right up to Connor and threw a massive stack of loan applications directly at his chest. The heavy papers hit him with a loud thud and scattered all over the expensive imported rug at his feet. I told him he was a disgusting, pathetic coward for trying to pin his massive federal crimes on a man who could no longer defend himself. I ordered everyone in the room to look very closely at the signatures stamped at the bottom of those pages. I pointed out that Marcus had a highly distinct, elegant signature that he had perfected over decades of signing complex corporate contracts. The signature on those toxic loans was a frantic, sloppy forgery. It was the desperate, shaky handwriting of a terrified man trying frantically to cover his tracks. I took a step closer to Connor, forcing him to press his back hard against the ornate marble fireplace. I told him that the independent forensic handwriting analysts, hired by the secret corporate auditors, had already flagged every single one of those signatures as a complete and utter fraud. Furthermore, I reminded him of a simple, undeniable fact. The dates stamped on the 2 largest predatory loan agreements coincided exactly with a week when Marcus was in the hospital recovering from a minor surgical procedure. My husband was heavily medicated and physically incapable of holding a pen, let alone authorizing a multi-million-dollar shadow loan. I looked Connor dead in his pale, terrified eyes and told him his lies were as sloppy as his financial management. Connor scrambled to his knees, desperately trying to gather the scattered papers from the floor. His hands were shaking so violently he kept dropping the pages back onto the rug. He stammered uncontrollably, trying to formulate another excuse, claiming the auditors were biased and that he could easily explain the dates to a judge. But I was entirely finished wasting my breath on him. I turned my attention completely to Diane. She was standing frozen near the center of the room, her face a tight mask of absolute horror as she watched her wealthy, pristine reality violently crumble before her eyes. I reached into my folder and pulled out one final document. It was a faded, slightly yellowed page printed on heavy legal stock. I held it up high so the bright morning sunlight pouring through the bay windows illuminated the dense legal text perfectly. The lighting in the room seemed to focus intensely on this single piece of paper, making it impossible for anyone to ignore. I addressed Diane, keeping my voice chillingly calm and deliberate. I asked her if she remembered signing a massive stack of routine corporate tax renewals and estate planning updates in Connor's executive office about 6 months ago. I reminded her of exactly how she used to brag about completely trusting her brilliant son-in-law to handle all the tedious legal paperwork. She always said reading financial documents gave her a severe headache, and that a true matriarch delegates the boring details to the men in the family. She had handed over her financial security to a man simply because he wore a nice suit and shared her toxic prejudices. Diane stared at the faded document in my hand, her eyes widening in sheer paralyzing terror as she recognized her own sweeping cursive handwriting at the very bottom of the page. The crisp blue ink of her signature stood out like a glowing neon sign against the yellowed paper. I explained the brutal reality of that signature to her. I told her that Connor knew forging Marcus' signature on the primary loans was nowhere near enough to secure the massive shadow capital he desperately needed to cover his catastrophic losses. The predatory private equity firms were not stupid. They demanded a secondary guarantor with massive tangible assets to back up the high-interest debt in case the company defaulted. Connor needed someone wealthy, gullible, and entirely too arrogant to actually read the fine print before signing. He needed the perfect victim, and he found her sitting right at the head of the Sunday dinner table. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, letting every single word land with maximum devastating impact. "You thought your precious white son-in-law loved you, Mom?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly and sharply in the quiet living room. "You thought he respected the prestigious Washington bloodline. You thought he was protecting your legacy. But he slipped this commercial guarantor agreement right into the middle of your routine tax paperwork, and you proudly signed it without asking a single question. He tricked you into mortgaging the very mansion you are sitting in right now." The absolute silence in the room was suffocating. I did not stop. I explained to her with absolute brutal clarity exactly what that single signature meant in the eyes of the federal law. I told her she had legally pledged her entire personal estate, her luxury vehicles, her offshore investment accounts, and this exact multi-million-dollar custom-built home as direct collateral for Connor's toxic loans. I told her that when the bank formally initiates bankruptcy proceedings by the end of this week, they will not just seize the logistics company. They will send federal marshals directly to these heavy oak front doors. They will seize the custom emerald green velvet sofas she is currently sitting on. They will seize the expensive abstract artwork hanging on her walls. They will seize the designer gowns hanging in her massive walk-in closet. They will publicly auction off every single piece of the glorious Washington family legacy, just to pay off the $8.5 million her golden son-in-law stole from my husband. She had actively aided in my husband's destruction, and in return, Connor had successfully stripped her of every single dime she owned. She was no longer a powerful aristocratic matriarch. She was a bankrupt accomplice heading straight for a massive public humiliation and a potential federal indictment. Diane looked from my face to the faded document, and then slowly turned her head to look at Connor, who was still cowering on the floor. Her chest began to heave violently, moving up and down in rapid, erratic jerks. She reached up with a trembling manicured hand and clutched tightly at the silk fabric of her morning gown right over her heart. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp, desperately fighting for air, as the full, crushing weight of her immediate financial ruin slammed directly into her chest. Her knees completely buckled beneath her, and she collapsed heavily onto the sofa, gasping loudly like a fish pulled out of water. Chloe, who had been sitting in paralyzed silence throughout my entire speech, suddenly snapped. The terrifying realization that her husband had not just stolen the company, but had effectively made her and her mother entirely homeless, completely broke her brain. Her massive trust fund was gone. Her summer house remodel was entirely canceled. Her entire identity as a wealthy socialite had been violently ripped away by the man she married. Chloe let out a piercing, high-pitched scream that sounded exactly like a deranged banshee. It was a sound of pure primal fury. She leaped out of her armchair, her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. Her manicured hands curled into vicious, sharp claws, and she lunged violently across the marble coffee table, determined to slap Connor right across his terrified, pale face. Chloe's manicured nails raked violently across Connor's cheek, leaving 3 deep, bloody scratches trailing down his pale skin. The sharp cracking sound of her palm connecting with his jaw echoed like a gunshot over Diane's ragged gasps. Connor let out a shout of pain and completely lost his balance, falling hard against the heavy marble edge of the fireplace. But Chloe did not stop her relentless assault. She climbed right over the coffee table, knocking the solid gold fountain pen and the fake legal waiver onto the floor. She grabbed the lapels of his expensive light blue suit, shaking him violently while screaming directly into his face. She demanded to know where her money was. She shrieked that he was a worthless, pathetic loser who promised her the world and instead gave her absolutely nothing but a looming federal prison sentence. Connor raised his arms, trying to shield his face from her scratching hands, but Chloe was completely unhinged. She pounded her fists against his chest, tearing the expensive tailored fabric of his suit jacket. She screamed that she would see him rot in a cell. She yelled that he had destroyed her pristine social standing and that she would be the ultimate laughingstock of her elite country club circle. To Chloe, the threat of criminal charges was entirely secondary to the horrific nightmare of being perceived as poor by her wealthy friends. For a few seconds, Connor just took the physical beating, his face contorted in pain and sheer shock. But then something dark inside him finally snapped. The polished corporate executive vanished entirely. Connor grabbed both of Chloe's wrists with a sudden vicious strength and violently shoved her backward. Chloe stumbled, hitting her back against the side of the velvet armchair and collapsing onto the hardwood floor in a heap of bright white designer loungewear. Connor stood up, panting heavily. Bright red blood trickled down his cheek from the deep scratches. His hair was completely disheveled, and his eyes burned with an absolute manic, furious rage. He looked down at his wife sprawling on the floor, and then over at his mother-in-law gasping for air on the sofa. He let out a loud, bitter laugh that sounded completely detached from reality. "You want to know where your money is, Chloe," he yelled, his voice raw and echoing with pure venom. "You spent it. You and your mother spent every single dime of it trying to pretend you were American royalty." He stepped away from the fireplace, pointing a trembling, accusing finger directly at Diane. "Do not sit there and act like you are some innocent victim in all of this, Diane. You are just as guilty as I am. You handed me the entire company on a silver platter because you were too busy drinking champagne at your charity galas to actually read a single financial statement. You wanted the prestige of having a white financial director running your business because you thought it made you look more sophisticated to your wealthy friends. You hated the fact that a black logistics company required you to associate with truck drivers and warehouse workers. You wanted the clean corporate money without getting your hands dirty, and you were completely willing to let me do whatever it took to keep the cash flowing." Connor turned his furious gaze back to Chloe, who was staring up at him in absolute shock, her chest heaving. "And you," he spat, his voice dripping with intense, unadulterated disgust, "you are the most arrogant, entitled woman I have ever met in my entire life. You never worked a single day. You treated your own brother like a personal automated teller machine. Do you really think I loved you? Do you honestly think I wanted to spend my life listening to you whine about designer handbags and summer house renovations? You were nothing but an incredibly easy target." Connor was pacing the floor now, his hands wildly gesturing as he confessed his entire sinister motivation, loud and clear for the room to hear. He admitted that he targeted the Washington family specifically because he saw their massive, glaring vulnerability. He saw a family completely consumed by their own ego and entirely driven by extreme superficial greed. He said it was incredibly easy to manipulate them because all he had to do was tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. He told Diane she was a brilliant matriarch. He told Chloe she deserved the absolute best. And in return, they blindly signed every single legal document he put in front of them. You gave me the keys to the vault because you were so desperate to feel superior to everyone else, Connor shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. You let me forge documents. You let me set up shell companies in your name, Chloe, because you liked seeing yourself listed as a chief executive officer on paper. You did not care where the money came from as long as you could buy another imported sports car. You exploited Marcus just as much as I did. The only difference is that I was actually smart enough to take the cash and run, while you two fools sat here drinking champagne waiting for the massive inheritance check to clear. He laughed again, a harsh grating sound that filled the vibrant living room with absolute dread. You thought you were using me to legitimize your family legacy, but I was using you to build my own personal fortune. You are a family of greedy, arrogant fools, and you deserve absolutely everything that the federal government is going to do to you. The sheer brutality of his words hung heavily in the air. He had violently stripped away every single illusion they held about themselves. He exposed them not just as victims of his elaborate fraud, but as active, willing participants driven by their own blinding vanity. Diane let out a loud, wailing sob, pressing her face into the velvet cushions of the sofa, completely shattered. The matriarch of the Washington family was reduced to a crying, trembling mess of ruined silk and smeared makeup. Chloe just sat on the floor, staring blankly at the man she had married, finally realizing he had secretly hated her the entire time. Richard Vance, the sleazy private attorney, decided he had seen more than enough. He quietly picked up his battered leather briefcase and began inching toward the grand arched doorway, desperately hoping to slip out unnoticed before the federal authorities arrived. He wanted absolutely no part of this massive criminal conspiracy. He knew that the level of wire fraud Connor just confessed to carried decades in federal prison. But Connor was not finished. He turned his manic, terrifying gaze back toward me. I was still sitting calmly in my chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the entire horrific spectacle unfold. Connor looked at my calm demeanor, and then his eyes darted down to the sleek silver laptop resting on the marble coffee table. In his panicked, irrational mind, that laptop was the absolute source of all his current misery. He believed that if he could just destroy the machine, he could somehow destroy the audio recording and the digital evidence tying him to the massive financial fraud. He did not realize I had multiple encrypted backups stored safely on external drives hidden far away from this house. You smug little bitch! Connor growled, his fists clenching tightly at his sides. You think you have won. You think you can just waltz in here and destroy my entire life. He let out a furious roar and lunged across the space separating us. He did not care about the physical consequences anymore. He was operating entirely on pure, desperate adrenaline. He reached his hands out, aiming directly for my laptop, fully intending to snatch it off the marble table and smash it into 1,000 pieces against the hardwood floor. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle to protect the computer. I just sat there looking him dead in the eye, waiting for the inevitable intervention. Before Connor's hands could even graze the edge of the keyboard, a tall, broad-shouldered figure suddenly stepped right through the grand arched doorway. A massive hand shot out and clamped down firmly onto the collar of Richard Vance, the sneaking attorney violently shoving the corrupt lawyer backward until he collapsed heavily into a nearby accent chair. The sudden violent movement caught Connor's attention, making him freeze in his tracks just inches away from my laptop. He looked up, his pale eyes wide with surprise and lingering rage. Jamal stood in the doorway, entirely blocking the only exit out of the living room. He had completely dropped his nervous, anxious demeanor from the previous night. He stood tall, his jaw clenched and his dark eyes burning with absolute loyalty to Marcus. and pure righteous anger toward the man who had destroyed the company. He looked Connor up and down, taking in the torn, tailored suit and the bleeding scratches on his face. Jamal took one slow, deliberate step into the room, his deep voice echoing with undeniable, unyielding authority. "I would not do that if I were you, Connor." Connor froze his chest, heaving his fist hovering just inches above the polished marble coffee table. Jamal stepped fully into the room, his massive frame easily dwarfing Connor's tailored suit. Jamal did not raise his voice, but the quiet, lethal menace in his tone made Connor slowly lower his hands and take a stumbling step backward. Richard Vance, the sleazy private attorney, pressed himself as far back into the accent chair as physically possible, desperately wishing he could simply melt into the upholstery and become invisible. The chaotic, violent energy that had just torn the luxurious living room apart suddenly evaporated completely, replaced by an absolute chilling stillness. I did not even flinch. I reached out and calmly closed my laptop, letting the bright screen go black. The audio recording had already done its job. I looked at Connor, who was now breathing heavily through his mouth, darting his pale eyes between me and Jamal like a trapped animal frantically calculating its final desperate escape route. I told Connor he was incredibly predictable. I said he resorted to aggressive physical violence the exact second his intellectual superiority was completely dismantled. The camera of my life felt entirely stable now. The shaking, the fear, and the overwhelming grief were gone completely, replaced by a cold, absolute control. I reached into my black designer leather purse for the final time. I bypassed the thick appraisal reports and the audio files. My fingers closed around the heavy fireproof security envelope I had pulled from the deepest corner of the biometric wall safe last night. I brought it out and placed it gently on the coffee table right next to the solid gold fountain pen he had tried to force me to use. I broke the red tamper evidence seal with a sharp snap that echoed like a gavel in the quiet room. I pulled out the crisp, thick parchment paper. I held it up so the bright morning sunlight caught the elegant, sweeping signature at the very bottom of the page. I looked at Diane, who was still weeping hysterically into the emerald green velvet cushions, and Chloe, who was staring blankly from the hardwood floor. I told them they were entirely wrong about Marcus. They thought he was weak. They thought he was completely blind to their overwhelming greed and their constant manipulation. But Marcus was a visionary, and he was 10 times the businessman Connor could ever hope to be. I explained that Marcus discovered the multi-million-dollar wire fraud 3 full months ago. He found the 6 fraudulent shell companies. He found the massive, toxic junk loans. He saw the meticulously forged signatures where Connor had desperately attempted to frame me for the entire criminal enterprise. The profound heartbreak of realizing his own mother and sister were actively conspiring with a parasite to destroy his life and frame his wife was the exact agonizing stress that ultimately triggered his fatal heart attack. They broke his heart, but they did not break his brilliant mind. Instead of confronting them and giving Connor the opportunity to shred the evidence or flee the jurisdiction, Marcus quietly went to work. He hired an independent forensic accounting firm to track every single stolen dime. And while Connor was busy popping champagne, playing golf, and acting the role of the invincible corporate mastermind, Marcus was legally building an impenetrable financial fortress around me. I looked directly at Richard Vance, the sweating legal mercenary, and asked him if he was thoroughly familiar with the federal statutes regarding an irrevocable living trust. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and nodded slowly, his eyes wide with sudden terrifying realization. I turned my gaze back to Connor and spelled it out for him so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. I told Connor that Marcus systematically separated every single clean, untainted asset from the toxic corporate accounts. He quietly liquidated $12 million in clean personal stock options. He transferred the legal deed to our primary private residence, and he moved his massive multi-million-dollar life insurance policy completely out of the family estate. He placed every single piece of that massive fortune directly into this irrevocable trust. I watched Connor's face contort in pure agony as I explained the brutal legal reality. By federal law, the exact second those assets crossed into the trust, they ceased to be Marcus property. They became an entirely separate legal entity. They cannot be touched by corporate bankruptcy proceedings. They cannot be seized by the shadow lenders Connor foolishly borrowed from, and most importantly, they are completely shielded from the federal investigators who are about to rip Washington Freight apart. I looked down at the parchment paper and read the final clause loud and clear. The sole legally appointed trustee and the single exclusive beneficiary of this $12 million trust is me, Nia Washington. Connor's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the edge of the ornate marble fireplace just to keep himself from collapsing entirely onto the floor. His lips moved silently, but he could not form a single coherent word. The absolute finality of the irrevocable trust crushed whatever tiny sliver of arrogant hope he had left. He finally realized that the massive fortune he thought he was stealing was completely out of his reach forever. He had committed massive federal wire fraud, he had destroyed his marriage, and he had ruined his life for a company that was entirely bankrupt. I told Connor that his grand intimidation plan backfired beautifully. By forcing me to sign a legal waiver surrendering my rights to the estate, he was actually doing me a massive favor. He thought he was locking me out of the family fortune, but he was actually locking himself inside a burning building. He had actively fought to take sole legal ownership of a massive criminal liability. I stood up gracefully, smoothing the front of my tailored navy blue business suit. I looked down at the three people who had made my life a living hell for the past 8 years. I delivered the final, devastating truth, watching it land like a physical blow. Marcus did not write that fake will you brought here today, Connor, but he did fully intend for you to take over the company. He deliberately left Washington Freight to Diane and Chloe. He wanted you to have the controlling shares. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, my voice dropping to a cold, merciless whisper that commanded the absolute silence of the room. Marcus left the company to you guys because he knew the FBI needed a fall guy for that wire fraud mess. The absolute finality of my words hung in the air like a physical weight pressing down on their chests. Connor stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He finally understood the complete and total magnitude of his failure. Marcus had not just beaten him, he had orchestrated a masterclass in posthumous revenge. Before Connor could even attempt to formulate a single desperate response to the devastating truth, a new sound pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the living room. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the far distance, but it grew rapidly louder and more aggressive with every passing second. The distinct, piercing shriek of multiple police sirens echoed sharply down the wealthy suburban street, cutting through the quiet morning air. Suddenly, the bright, warm morning sunlight pouring through the massive bay windows was violently interrupted. Harsh flashing beams of red and blue police lights swept aggressively across the pristine white walls, painting the expensive abstract artwork and the emerald green velvet sofas in chaotic strobing colors. The heavy tires of multiple armored tactical vehicles screeched to a violent halt on the circular gravel driveway outside, completely surrounding the estate. Connor spun around, looking out the window, his pale face draining of whatever tiny drop of blood it had left. The front lawn was swarming with men and women wearing dark, heavy tactical gear. Bright yellow letters spelling out Federal Bureau of Investigation and Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation were prominently emblazoned across their thick, bulletproof vests. The sheer overwhelming force of the federal government had officially arrived at the Washington estate, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. A loud, booming voice echoed from a heavy police megaphone outside, demanding that everyone inside the residence remain exactly where they were, with their hands clearly visible. But they did not wait for anyone to come politely open the door. A massive, deafening crash shook the entire foundation of the house as a heavy steel battering ram completely shattered the locking mechanism of the double oak front doors. The heavy wood splintered and flew wildly across the marble foyer, landing with a loud clatter against the baseboards. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents stormed into the grand hallway, their heavy black boots stomping aggressively over the expensive imported rugs. They flooded the formal living room in a highly coordinated tactical formation, sweeping the area with absolute military precision. Jamal smoothly took a step back, raising his hands calmly in the air and moving entirely out of the line of fire. He gave the lead federal agent a short, respectful nod, completely unfazed by the sudden, chaotic invasion. Connor completely lost his mind. The primal, panicked instinct of a cornered predator took over his rational brain. He bolted. He turned sharply away from the bay windows and lunged toward the rear hallway, desperately trying to reach the back exit of the mansion. But he did not even make it 3 steps. A massive federal agent tackled him squarely in the back. The sheer physical force of the impact launched Connor completely through the air. He crashed violently, face first, onto the polished hardwood floor, his expensive light blue tailored suit tearing loudly at the shoulder seams. 3 more federal agents instantly piled on top of him, pressing their heavy tactical knees firmly into his lower spine and the back of his neck. Connor thrashed wildly against the floorboards, screaming hysterically that they were making a massive mistake and that he was a highly respected corporate executive. He demanded to call his lawyer, violently thrashing his head back and forth against the wood. An agent roughly grabbed his wrists, twisting his arms painfully behind his back and slapping a pair of heavy, solid steel handcuffs onto his wrists with a loud, sharp click. The lead agent leaned down, pressing his face close to Connor's bleeding, scratched cheek, and began loudly reading him his Miranda rights, citing multiple federal counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and massive tax evasion. Diane watched her golden son-in-law being brutally subdued on her living room floor and realized her aristocratic immunity was completely gone. 2 federal agents turned their stern, unyielding attention directly toward her, pulling out another set of cold steel handcuffs. Diane immediately fell back onto her lifelong theatrical training. She let out a dramatic, piercing gasp, clutching her chest tightly with both hands, and falling dramatically back onto the emerald green velvet sofa. She began taking loud, ragged breaths, rolling her eyes back into her head, and loudly declaring that she was having a massive, fatal heart attack. She wailed that the stress of the brutal federal raid was killing her and demanded that they call her a private luxury ambulance immediately. The federal agents did not even blink at her pathetic, desperate performance. They had seen wealthy, white-collar criminals fake severe medical emergencies 1,000 times before. The lead agent calmly pulled a radio from his tactical vest and requested a standard emergency medical team to the living room. Within 2 short minutes, a pair of city paramedics rushed into the house, rolling a heavy metal medical stretcher over the splintered wood of the front door. They quickly checked Diane's vital signs. Her heart rate was slightly elevated from pure panic, but she was in absolutely no actual medical danger. The paramedics hoisted her roughly onto the stretcher, strapping her down tightly with heavy, thick nylon belts. Diane continued to scream and cry, begging the agents to let her call her private country club doctor to intervene. Instead, a female federal agent stepped right up to the stretcher, pulled Diane's wrist completely out from under the medical blanket, and locked a heavy steel handcuff tightly around her wrist, securing the other end directly to the thick metal rail of the medical bed. Diane Washington, the proud, untouchable matriarch of the family, was being rolled out of her own custom-built mansion, strapped down and shackled exactly like a common criminal. Chloe was completely hysterical. An agent had firmly grabbed her by the arm, pulling her roughly up from the hardwood floor where she had fallen earlier. She was hyperventilating, her bright white designer loungewear now heavily stained with Connor's blood and dark dirt from the rug. As the agent began snapping the cold handcuffs around her wrists, she saw me standing calmly by the marble coffee table. I had not moved a single inch, holding my black leather purse securely and watching the entire spectacular collapse of the Washington family with cold, absolute detachment. Chloe violently ripped her upper body away from the agent, dropping heavily to her knees and crawling frantically across the imported rug toward me. She reached her cuffed hands out, desperately trying to grab the clean hem of my navy blue business suit. "Nia, please," she sobbed hysterically, hot tears and thick black mascara streaming heavily down her flushed face. "Please, you have to help me. I am your sister. We are family. You have $12 million in that trust. Please just pay my bail. Please hire me a good lawyer. I cannot go to federal prison, Nia. I will do anything you want. I will give you back the house. I will give you whatever you ask for. Please do not leave me here. I looked down at the pathetic, sobbing mess of a woman who had just hours ago mocked my inability to have children and arrogantly told me to go back to the hood. I did not feel a single drop of pity or sympathy. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply took a slow, deliberate step backward, ensuring her dirty, manicured hands could not touch my tailored suit. I looked her dead in her terrified, tear-filled eyes. I told you earlier, Chloe. I said, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any human emotion. You are not family. You are a massive liability. I turned my back on her, completely ignoring her ear-piercing, desperate screams as two strong federal agents dragged her forcefully out the front door. I picked up my silver laptop and my thick commercial appraisal report, sliding them neatly and securely back into my purse. I gave Jamal a small, respectful nod of gratitude. He nodded back, a silent, powerful acknowledgement between two people who had just successfully executed the ultimate form of absolute justice for a man who deserved so much better. I turned and walked slowly out of the chaotic living room, my heels clicking rhythmically and confidently against the hardwood floor. I walked straight past Connor, who was being aggressively hauled to his feet by the back of his torn collar. I walked past Richard Vance, who was sitting completely frozen in the accent chair, anxiously waiting for his turn in federal handcuffs. I stepped carefully out through the shattered frame of the massive double oak front doors and walked out into the bright, crisp morning air. I walked down the grand stone steps and got straight into my car, locking the doors behind me. Behind me, the last federal agent dragged a kicking and screaming Chloe completely out of the marble foyer. The agent reached back and forcefully pulled the heavy, damaged front door closed. The heavy front door slammed shut with a final echoing thud. The flashing red and blue police lights slowly faded into the distance as the heavy armored vehicles drove away down the long suburban street. The once lively, vibrant Washington mansion was left eerily empty and completely dead. I am sitting here now in my own sunlit living room, far away from the toxic shadows of the Washington estate. The warm ceramic mug of chamomile tea in my hands brings a quiet comfort that I have finally learned to accept. It has been over a year since that chaotic morning when the federal tactical teams completely dismantled my in-laws' carefully constructed world of lies and extreme greed. Taking a slow, calm sip of my tea, I can honestly say that the absolute silence in my house today is the most beautiful sound in the entire world. The federal courts did not show my former family a single ounce of mercy. Connor was quickly convicted on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and massive tax evasion. He is currently serving a 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary, where his arrogant white savior complex and his expensive tailored suits do absolutely nothing to protect him. Diane lost absolutely everything. The banks aggressively seized the custom-built mansion, the luxury vehicles, and the hidden offshore investment accounts. She now lives in a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of the city, completely abandoned by the wealthy elite socialite friends she sacrificed her own son to impress. And Chloe is currently working long, grueling shifts at a local retail store, desperately trying to pay off the massive legal debts her criminal husband left behind. Her pristine designer wardrobe has been permanently replaced by a cheap polyester uniform, and her constant arrogant complaints are now completely ignored by the real world. The grieving process for Marcus was long and incredibly painful. Once the dust settled and the massive federal trials finally concluded, I finally had the quiet, safe space to properly mourn the brilliant man I loved. He was not perfect, but he loved me enough to protect me when it mattered the absolute most. Today I am running my own highly successful commercial real estate firm. The $12 million safely secured in my irrevocable trust remains completely untouched, quietly generating generational wealth for the future I am building entirely on my own terms. Looking back on the entire horrific ordeal, I realize exactly where they made their ultimate fatal mistake. They looked at me and saw someone they could easily manipulate and discard. They thought I was just a silent black woman. They forgot that silence is the best way to watch your enemies dig their own graves. While they were busy screaming cruel insults and celebrating their stolen fraudulent inheritance, I was quietly gathering the very tools needed to bury them. Marcus gave me the ultimate financial protection, but it was my own absolute refusal to be a victim that truly sealed their miserable fate. Family is supposed to be your ultimate safe haven. But sometimes the people who share your last name are the exact same people holding the knife to your back. If you are ever pushed into a corner by your own toxic family members, do not cry. Gather the evidence. Build your fortress in absolute silence and let their own blinding arrogance be the architect of their destruction. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like and subscribe to hear more thrilling stories of sweet revenge. Stay strong and goodbye.